What happens when a 700-year-old king snaps awake the instant you touch the wrong stone? Suddenly, you're stuck with a ruler who commands like it's do or die, while your pulse keeps exploding with power you never trained for. Every mile you travel together twists the danger tighter, and one truth hits harder than all the rest. You were never chosen by accident. The wind that screamed through the Valar Mountains carried no mercy, only the bitter promise of another night that would strip warmth from bone and hope from heart. Karen crouched at the entrance of the excavation site, fingers trembling not merely from cold but from exhaustion that had become his constant companion, his only reliable friend in a world that had offered him nothing but closed doors and contemptuous glances. 28 years he had walked this earth, and for nearly half of those years he had pursued a dream that everyone told him was foolish, chasing ghosts of a civilization that the academic establishment insisted had never existed beyond myth and superstition. The tattered journal pressed against his chest beneath 3 layers of inadequate clothing contained his mother's final words, scribbled in a hand weakened by the illness that would take her within days of that last entry, and those words had become both his compass and his curse. He had been 7 when she died, leaving him with nothing but that journal and a silver pendant that bore markings no scholar could interpret. His father had vanished before Karen's birth, a detail his mother rarely discussed except to say that he had been different, that he had possessed gifts that frightened people, and that the world was not kind to those who carried ancient blood. The orphanage in the lowland city of Marith had been his home for 11 years, a place where the other children sensed something strange about him and kept their distance, where the headmistress looked at him with suspicion whenever he woke screaming from dreams of vast halls filled with silver light and voices singing in languages he did not know. Those dreams had intensified as he grew older, becoming more vivid, more insistent, until he could sketch the architecture of places he had never visited and recite fragments of texts in scripts that resembled nothing in modern linguistic records. The university had rejected his application 4 times before a minor functionary, bored and perhaps pitying, had allowed him to enroll as a provisional student in the cultural anthropology program, a decision the department chair overturned within a semester when Chiron's thesis proposal suggested that the legends of Alpha and Omega hierarchies were historical fact rather than allegorical fiction. Omega, they had told him with barely concealed disdain, was a term that appeared in folklore and romance, not in legitimate historical analysis, and his insistence on pursuing such a line of inquiry demonstrated either profound ignorance or dangerous instability. The formal letter of dismissal had been waiting for him when he returned from his mother's grave on the 10th anniversary of her death, and he had stood in the rain reading those bureaucratic sentences that severed him from the only path he had believed might lead to answers. 7 years he had worked in menial positions, saving every coin, sleeping in shared rooms with strangers who stole what little he possessed, eating once a day when fortune allowed, all while continuing his research in archives that permitted him access only during hours when respectable scholars were absent. The librarians tolerated him because he caused no trouble, and because he sometimes repaired damaged volumes with a careful hand, but their tolerance was not acceptance, and their eyes followed him with the same wariness he had known his entire life. He found references in obscure texts, fragments that mentioned the Valar Mountains as the seat of the last Alpha King, whispers of a vault where something precious and terrible had been sealed away when the old world collapsed into war and chaos. Most scholars dismissed such passages as the embellishments of imaginative scribes, but Karen had dreams of those mountains, dreams where he walked through corridors of stone that hummed with power and purpose, where voices called his name in tones of desperate urgency. Gathering funding had been impossible through legitimate channels, so he had done what desperation demanded, accepting a contract from a private collector who wanted artifacts from pre-schism sites and who did not ask uncomfortable questions about credentials or institutional backing. The money was enough to purchase basic equipment, hire a guide to lead him into the mountains, and secure supplies for a 3-month expedition, though the guide had abandoned him after 2 weeks, declaring that the ruins Karen sought were cursed, and that no amount of payment justified disturbing whatever rested in those depths. Alone, working with inadequate tools and no support, Chiron had continued excavating the site his research suggested contained the vault mentioned in the ancient texts, driven by a conviction that felt less like choice and more like obligation, as if something in his blood demanded that he complete this task regardless of cost. The villagers in the nearest settlement, a collection of weathered structures clinging to the mountainside 5 miles below his excavation, regarded him with open hostility when he descended every 2 weeks to purchase food and lamp oil. They called him stranger, outsider, fool, and occasionally they used other words, terms in a dialect he did not fully understand but whose venom required no translation. An old woman had spat at his feet during his last visit, hissing that he was disturbing the bones of the damned, and that blood would answer blood before the season turned. He had not understood her warning then, but he understood fear, having lived with it as his shadow since childhood, and he recognized the particular terror in her eyes as something beyond mere superstition. The excavation site itself was a wound in the mountainside, a place where stone had been deliberately worked in patterns that suggested both architecture and ritual. The deeper he dug, the more convinced he became that he had found something significant, something that predated the schism that had shattered the old kingdoms and given birth to the modern era of fragmented territories and forgotten histories. The symbols carved into the walls matched those in his mother's journal, matched the marks on his pendant, and sometimes when he traced them with his fingers, he felt warmth spreading through his palms, as if the stone remembered being alive. 3 weeks ago, he had uncovered the first seal, a massive disk of black stone inscribed with concentric circles of text in the ancient lupine script he had taught himself to read through years of painstaking study. And he had known with absolute certainty that he was standing before the very vault his research had promised. Breaking the seal had taken days of careful work, not because the stone was particularly hard, but because something in him hesitated, some instinct whispering that once this threshold was crossed, there would be no returning to the life he had known, inadequate and painful, though that life had been. He had pressed forward nonetheless, driven by need that transcended mere academic curiosity, and when the seal finally cracked under the pressure of the iron pry bar he had purchased in the village, the sound that emerged was not the grinding of stone on stone, but something closer to an exhalation, as if the mountain itself had been holding its breath for centuries, and now released it in a rush of stale air that tasted of ice and iron, and something indefinably other. The chamber beyond was smaller than he had anticipated, barely 15 feet across, and empty, save for a raised platform at its center, upon which rested a figure that his mind initially refused to accept as real. The man was tall, perhaps 6.5 feet, with a build that suggested both strength and grace, and he lay as one sleeping, hands crossed over his chest, dressed in garments that belonged to an age Chiron had only read about in texts the academic establishment declared fraudulent. Silver hair fell past broad shoulders, and even in repose the face possessed a severity that spoke of authority accustomed to instant obedience. Most striking were the markings visible on the exposed skin of his neck and wrists, intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the lamplight, sometimes appearing as mere tattoos, and sometimes seeming to move with a life of their own. Chiron had approached slowly, every rational part of his mind insisting that this was a statue, an incredibly preserved sculpture, anything but an actual body that had somehow remained uncorrupted for what his research suggested was over 700 years. He had reached out, telling himself he merely wished to verify the material, to determine if this was stone or preserved flesh, and the moment his fingertips made contact with the cold skin of the figure's hand, light had exploded through the chamber with such intensity that he had been thrown backward, striking his head against the wall hard enough to see stars swimming in his vision. When his sight cleared, the figure was no longer lying peacefully, but sitting upright, eyes open and blazing with power that made Chiron's chest constrict with terror so profound he could not even draw breath to scream. Those eyes were the color of molten gold, and they fixed on him with an intensity that felt like being seen not merely physically, but in every hidden corner of his being, every secret fear and desperate hope exposed to scrutiny by a gaze that had witnessed empires rise and fall. The voice that spoke was rough from disuse but carried unmistakable command. Words in the ancient tongue that Chiron's studies allowed him to partially understand. Something about time and seal and betrayal. Before the figure's eyes rolled back and he collapsed forward, unconscious but undeniably, impossibly alive, Chiron had crawled to the fallen man, driven by instinct he did not understand, and pressed shaking hands to the broad chest, feeling the slow but steady rhythm of a heartbeat that should not exist. The pendant his mother had left him was burning against his skin, hot enough that he tore it from around his neck, watching in shock as it blazed with the same golden light that had filled the chamber moments before. The markings on the stranger's skin were glowing now, pulsing in time with that impossible heartbeat, and Chiron felt something inside himself responding. Some part of his being he had never known existed suddenly awakening in recognition of a presence it had been waiting for across a gulf of centuries. He had managed to drag the unconscious man out of the chamber, a feat that should have been impossible given the size difference. But adrenaline and something else, something that felt like strength flowing into him from a source beyond himself, had granted him capability beyond his normal limits. The stranger remained unconscious for 3 days, breathing but unresponsive, while Chiron kept watch, unable to leave, unable to explain even to himself why the thought of abandoning this man filled him with anguish that bordered on physical pain. He had tried to make the figure comfortable in the tent he had erected near the excavation entrance, covering him with every blanket he possessed, building fires that barely held back the mountain cold, rationing food and water, while his mind spun through increasingly frantic attempts to rationalize what was happening. On the 3rd night, the stranger had opened his eyes and spoken in words Chiron could understand, though the accent was strange and the phrasing archaic. The voice had asked where he was, how long he had been sealed, who had broken the vault, and Chiron had answered as best he could, watching emotions cross that severe face in rapid succession. Confusion, anger, grief, and finally a terrible weariness that made the stranger look not merely old, but ancient beyond counting. When Chiron had asked who he was, the answer had come with simple, devastating finality. "I am Adren, last of the Alpha Kings, and you have awakened me into a world that wanted me dead." The days that followed had been a descent into confusion and fear that made Chiron's previous life seem almost peaceful by comparison. Adren was weak, his body struggling to adjust after 7 centuries of suspended animation. But even weakened, he radiated a presence that made Chiron acutely aware of his own insignificance. The Alpha King demanded explanations, wanting to understand what had become of his kingdom, his people, the world he had known. And Chiron had tried to explain the schism, the collapse of the old hierarchies, the way modern society had fragmented into territorial states that barely remembered the age of Alpha and Omega monarchies. Each revelation seemed to wound Adren, adding fresh pain to eyes that already held more sorrow than Chiron could comprehend. And sometimes the king would lapse into long silences, staring at nothing, lost in memories of a world that existed now only in fragments of disputed text. Worse than Adren's grief was the connection Chiron felt growing between them, an awareness that seemed to bypass conscious thought and operate on a level of instinct he had no framework to understand. He found himself knowing when Adren was in pain before the king showed any outward sign, found his own emotional state shifting in response to the older man's moods, found himself compelled to stay close even when every rational impulse screamed that he should flee this situation and never look back. The pendant his mother had left him reacted violently whenever he tried to put distance between himself and Adren, burning hot enough to blister his skin, and the markings on the king's body would flare with corresponding light, as if some ancient magic bound them together regardless of their will. Adren had explained, during one of the moments when weakness forced him to rest and made him more willing to answer questions, that the vault had been sealed by Omega power at the height of the war that destroyed his kingdom. His own council had betrayed him, convinced that his attempts to restore balance between the castes would only prolong the bloodshed, and they had worked with Omega ritualists to create a prison that would hold him until the conflict resolved itself through mutual destruction. The seal should have been unbreakable, maintainable only by the bloodline of the Omega who had crafted it, and the fact that Chiron had been able to open it suggested connections that neither of them fully understood, but that Adrian regarded with growing unease. The visions that had plagued Chiron since childhood intensified after Adrian's awakening, becoming so vivid that sometimes he could not distinguish between past and present, between memory and current experience. He saw through eyes that were not his own, witnessed events that had occurred centuries before his birth, walked through the halls of a palace that had crumbled to dust long ago. In these visions, he was someone else, someone important, someone whose decisions shaped the fate of nations. And always there was a presence beside him, a figure whose face he could never quite see, but whose voice he recognized with a certainty that defied logic. Adrian's voice, younger and without the weight of sorrow that now colored every word, speaking his name with affection that felt simultaneously alien and achingly familiar. Resources were running dangerously low, and the village below would not sell to him anymore, the old woman's warning having apparently spread through the community, until even the most mercenary among them refused his coin. Adrian was growing stronger, but was still far from the power he claimed to have once possessed, and the mountain weather was turning hostile as the season shifted toward winter, promising snow that would make the excavation site uninhabitable within weeks. They needed to leave, needed to reach civilization where Chiron might find answers and Adrian might find his bearings in this strange new world. But the journey down the mountain was treacherous even in good conditions, and Chiron was not certain either of them possessed the strength to survive it in their current state. It was on the 7th night after Adrian's awakening that Chiron's world shifted from merely difficult to actively dangerous. He had descended to the village one final time, hoping to trade his excavation equipment for food and warm clothing, willing to abandon everything he owned if it meant securing supplies for the journey ahead. The villagers had not even allowed him to speak, surrounding him the moment he entered the settlement, their faces twisted with fear and rage that had clearly been building since his arrival. The old woman was there, and she spoke in that dialect he only partly understood, but her meaning was clear enough. He had brought evil down on them, awakened something that should have remained buried, and now blood would pay for blood as the old laws demanded. They had beaten him with practiced efficiency, not the wild assault of an angry mob, but the methodical violence of people executing a sentence they believed just. He had tried to explain, tried to make them understand that he meant no harm, that his research was purely academic, but his words were lost beneath the sound of fists striking flesh and boots connecting with bone. Someone had torn his mother's journal from his coat, and he had watched through swelling eyes as they fed it to a fire, page by page, erasing the last tangible connection to the woman who had given him purpose. The pendant they had tried to take as well, but when they pulled it from his neck, it had flared with that same golden light, burning the hand of the man who held it badly enough that he dropped it with a scream, and after that, they had been afraid to touch it, settling instead for binding Chiron's hands and dragging him to the edge of the village where a deep crevasse split the mountain. The old woman had spoken again, and this time Chiron understood enough to know she was pronouncing his death sentence, declaring him corrupted by ancient evil and deserving of the fate they gave to those who trafficked with demons. They had intended to throw him into the crevasse, to let the mountain swallow him as it had swallowed so many secrets over the long centuries, and he had known with absolute certainty that he was going to die here, alone and unmourned, having accomplished nothing except confirming every doubt the world had ever held about him. The hands that gripped his arms were already lifting him when the temperature dropped so suddenly that breath became visible mist, and a voice he knew spoke a single word in the ancient tongue that made every person in that square freeze as if turned to stone. Adrian stood at the edge of the firelight, and though he still bore the weakness of his long imprisonment, in that moment he looked every inch the king he claimed to be, presence radiating power that made the air itself feel heavy. The markings on his visible skin blazed with golden light, and his eyes held the same terrifying intensity Chiron had seen when he first awakened, a gaze that promised both judgment and absolute authority. He spoke again, words flowing in the ancient language with such command that Chiron felt them resonating in his chest, and the villagers released their hold, stumbling backward, several falling to their knees in postures of instinctive submission. that they clearly neither understood nor could resist. The Alpha King walked forward slowly, and people parted before him as water parts before stone, their fear now transformed from angry certainty to profound terror at the presence of something their blood recognized, even if their minds did not. He reached Chiron and cut the bonds with a knife that appeared from somewhere in his archaic clothing, then pulled the younger man to his feet with a grip that was gentle despite the strength Chiron could feel coiled in that hand. The old woman tried to speak, her voice shaking, but Adrian silenced her with a gesture, and when he finally addressed the crowd, it was in their own language, words simple but carrying unmistakable weight. "This one is under my protection, and any who harm him answer to me." They had left the village with no one daring to pursue, though Chiron felt eyes following them until they passed beyond sight, and he knew with cold certainty that word of what had happened would spread, that they had made themselves visible in ways that would have consequences neither of them could fully predict. Adrian had supported him through the first mile of the descent, until Chiron's legs remembered how to function properly, and the worst of the pain faded to manageable levels. And only then did the king allow himself to show the toll that such a display of power had taken, leaning against a boulder and breathing hard, hands shaking with exhaustion that spoke of reserves pushed far beyond their current limits. Chiron had asked why Adrian had come for him, why the king had risked revealing himself to save someone as insignificant as a failed scholar with no connections and no value. And the answer had come with a frustration that suggested the question annoyed Adrian as much as the situation itself. "Because I felt you dying. Because something in me demanded I act. Because apparently, the bond that Seal created between us does not care about logic or safety or any of the things that should govern rational behavior." The admission had clearly cost the king something, a yielding of pride that sat poorly on shoulders accustomed to authority, and Chiron had not pressed further, sensing that Adrian was struggling with the reality of their connection as much as he was. They had made camp in a sheltered hollow halfway down the mountain, and Chiron had tended Adrian's exhaustion as best he could with their limited supplies, watching the king slip into restless sleep while his own mind refused rest, turning over and over the events of the evening and the undeniable reality that his life had become inextricably tangled with a man from another age, a stranger who was somehow not a stranger at all. The visions came again as he kept watch, stronger now, and in them he saw the same crevasse where he had nearly died, saw it as it had been centuries ago when a group of robed figures had stood around it performing a ritual that made the very air scream with power, saw among them a face that looked disturbingly like his own reflection, and heard that familiar voice speaking his name with a sorrow that transcended time itself. "I will find you again, when the seal breaks and the world has forgotten why we fought. I will find you again." He had woken Adrian from a nightmare that had the king gasping and reaching for weapons that no longer existed, had watched the disorientation clear from those golden eyes as they focused on him, had seen something shift in the older man's expression, a recognition that went beyond their few days of acquaintance. The king had reached out slowly, as if expecting Chiron to pull away, and traced the line of his jaw with fingers that trembled, speaking words in the ancient tongue too quiet for Chiron to fully hear, but whose tone carried such complex emotion that it made his throat tight. Then Adrian had pulled back, face closing into the severe mask he wore when trying to hide vulnerability, and declared that they needed to reach the coastal city of Elvaris, where archives might hold answers to the questions multiplying with each passing day. The journey down from the Valar Mountains took 6 days that tested every reserve of strength and will both of them possessed, and by the time they reached the lower settlements where the air was thicker and the temperature less hostile, Chiron was moving on determination alone, his body a collection of pains and exhaustions that blurred together into a constant state of suffering he had learned to ignore through long practice. Adrian was better, his supernatural constitution healing at a rate that would have been impossible for a normal human, but the toll of 7 centuries was not something that could be overcome in days or even weeks, and sometimes Chiron would catch the king staring at the landscape with an expression of such profound loss that it made him ache in sympathy for griefs he could not fully comprehend. They had avoided settlements where possible, Adrian's appearance and bearing drawing too much attention, but eventually the need for supplies had forced them to risk entering a trading post where merchants met to exchange goods moving between the mountain territories and the coastal regions. Chiron had done the negotiating, using the last of his money to purchase food and warmer clothing, while Adrian had waited outside, wrapped in a cloak that hid most of his distinctive features. It should have been a simple transaction, quick and forgettable, but the merchant's eyes had lingered too long on Chiron, had traced the bruises still visible on his face and the way he moved with obvious discomfort, and the questions that followed. Who was he traveling with? Where were they going? Was he in some kind of trouble? Had been too pointed to be casual curiosity. He had deflected as best he could and left quickly, but the damage was done. And that night, as they camped in a copse of trees a mile from the trading post, Adrian had declared that they were being followed, that something in the atmosphere had shifted in ways his instincts recognized, even if his conscious mind could not yet identify the threat. Chiron had felt it too, that sense of being watched, of hostile attention focused on them from the darkness beyond their small fire, and when he had asked what they should do, Adrian's answer had been grimly simple: "We run, or we fight, and I am not yet strong enough to guarantee victory in a fight." They had run, pushing through the night despite exhaustion, and the pursuit had followed. Close enough that sometimes Chiron could hear movement in the trees paralleling their path, could catch glimpses of shapes that moved too quickly, and with too much coordination to be random travelers. Dawn had found them at the edge of the lowlands, the mountains at their backs, and the road to Elvaris stretching before them, and their pursuers had finally shown themselves. A group of 6 figures dressed in the practical gear of hunters but carrying themselves with the discipline of trained fighters. Their leader had been a woman of perhaps 40, with scars marking her face and arms, and she had spoken to Adrian in the ancient tongue, words that made the king's entire body go rigid with shock and something that might have been fear. She had identified herself as Kessa, scout for a war band that served one of the regional clans, and she had declared that word of the Alpha King's awakening had already spread, carried by sources she did not name, but that were clearly well-organized and far-reaching. The clans were in upheaval, she said, old allegiances fracturing as different factions tried to determine what Adrian's return meant for the current balance of power, and there were those who believed that the only way to prevent another catastrophic war was to ensure the last Alpha King did not live long enough to gather followers. She was not there to kill him, she had clarified. Not yet, but she was there to deliver a message from her commander. Come to the neutral ground at Elvaris, meet with the assembled representatives, and prove that his intentions were peaceful, or be hunted down as a threat to the fragile stability that had taken centuries to build. Adrian had agreed, not because he trusted these strangers, but because refusal would have meant immediate combat that he was not confident of surviving. And Chiron had watched the exchange feeling utterly powerless, his presence irrelevant to discussions that would determine both their fates. Kessa's eyes had passed over him with dismissive assessment, clearly categorizing him as some unfortunate civilian caught up in events beyond his understanding, and he had not bothered to correct her assumption, too tired and too hurt to care what these people thought of him. They had traveled the final distance to Elvaris under escort that was simultaneously protection and imprisonment, and Chiron had used the time to explain to Adrian what he knew of the city, how it had grown from a small port into a major center of trade and learning, how its libraries held collections dating back to the Schism and before, how it was governed by a council of merchant houses that prized stability above all other considerations. Elvaris had grown far beyond anything Adrian remembered, sprawling along the coast in patterns that made no sense to someone whose understanding of cities came from an age of planned construction and careful hierarchy. And the king had stared at the chaotic jumble of architecture and humanity with visible distress, struggling to reconcile his memories with the reality before him. They had been taken not to the civic center, but to a compound on the city's eastern edge, a collection of buildings that clearly served as headquarters for whatever organization Kessa represented. And there they had been separated. Chiron led to a small room that was comfortable enough, but whose locked door made its nature as a cell unmistakable. while Adrian was taken somewhere deeper into the complex for purposes no one bothered to explain. Alone for the first time since the vault had opened, Karen had collapsed onto the narrow bed and finally allowed himself to acknowledge the reality of his situation. He had awakened something beyond his understanding, had become tangled in political conflicts he could not navigate, had committed himself to the fate of a man he barely knew for reasons he could not articulate, and every choice that had brought him to this point had been shaped by dreams and instincts he had never truly questioned. His mother's journal was gone, burned by villagers who saw him as a threat, and the pendant that had been his only inheritance was all he had left of her, and even that had proven to be something other than he had believed, some artifact of power that responded to Adrian's presence in ways that suggested purposes his mother had never explained. He had slept badly, dreams fragmented and disturbing, and when he woke it was to find a young woman in the room, dressed in the same practical gear as the scouts who had escorted them, watching him with an expression of clinical assessment that made him deeply uncomfortable. She had introduced herself as Miran, second to Kessa, and she had asked him questions that revealed far too much knowledge about his background, his failed academic career, his years of solitary research, his mother's death and the mysteries of his father's identity, even the details of his excavation in the mountains. When he had asked how she knew these things, her answer had been matter-of-fact and chilling. They had been watching him for over a year, ever since his research had started pointing toward the Valor Mountains, and the possibility that he might actually find what he was looking for. The implications had settled over him like ice water, the understanding that his choices had not been as free as he had believed, that forces he had never suspected had been tracking his movements, and perhaps even subtly guiding them toward the very outcome that had now occurred. Myron had confirmed what he was beginning to suspect, that there were those who had wanted the Alpha King found and awakened, and there were those who had desperately wished to prevent it, and he had been a tool used by one faction against another in a conflict whose full scope he still did not grasp. She had not been unkind in her delivery of this information, had even shown something approaching sympathy for his situation, but her words had stripped away the last of his illusions about being a free agent, pursuing his own goals in isolation from larger forces. Adrian had been returned to him that evening, and the king had been furious in ways that made the air around him seem to crackle with barely contained power, declaring that he had been questioned like a criminal and treated with less respect than he would have shown the lowest servant in his court, and that if these people believed the passage of centuries had stripped him of his authority, they would learn otherwise to their cost. Chiron had let him rage, recognizing that the anger was born as much from helplessness as from genuine outrage, and eventually Adrian had exhausted himself and collapsed into brooding silence, staring at the wall as if it might reveal answers that the present circumstances refused to provide. They had been held in that compound for 3 days while messengers came and went, and the building hummed with activity that no one bothered to explain to them, and during that time, Chiron had tried to prepare Adrian for what they might face when finally brought before whatever authority governed these proceedings. The king had listened, but retained his fundamental inability to truly grasp how much the world had changed, how the structures of power and respect he took for granted had been replaced by systems that operated on entirely different principles, and Chiron had known with sinking certainty that when Adrian finally faced the people who would judge his fate, the collision between ancient authority and modern pragmatism would not be peaceful. On the 4th day, they had been brought before the assembly, and Chiron's worst fears had been realized in the first moments of that meeting, as Adrian had stood before representatives of 7 different clans and territorial authorities and refused to show any of the deference or submission that those authorities clearly expected, speaking instead with the absolute confidence of one accustomed to being obeyed without question and making no allowance for the reality that his kingdom was dust, and his power was memory. The tensions had escalated rapidly, voices rising in anger and accusation, until finally one of the representatives, a harsh-faced man who commanded forces from the northern territories, had declared that no remnant of the old regime could be permitted to survive, that the Alpha King's very existence was a threat to the peace that had been so dearly purchased with the blood of millions, and that the only rational course was immediate execution. Chiron had felt something inside himself break at those words. Some barrier he had not known existed shattering to release power that flooded through him with such force that he had gasped aloud. And in that moment, every eye in the room had turned to him as golden light blazed from his skin in patterns that matched the markings on Adrian's body. The pendant around his neck had burst into brilliance that made the assembled representatives cry out and shield their eyes. And Chiron had felt something vast and ancient stirring inside him, memories that were not his own rising to the surface, a voice that spoke with his mouth but carried authority and presence that had never been his. "You will not harm him, not while I yet have breath and power to prevent it." The words had been in the ancient tongue, but their meaning had been clear to everyone present. And in the shocked silence that followed, Chiron had felt Adrian's gaze on him with an intensity that bordered on physical pressure, had known without looking that the king was seeing him now, with new understanding, with recognition of something that had been hidden even from Chiron himself until this moment of crisis forced it into being. The power had faded as quickly as it came, leaving him shaking and weak, and he had collapsed to his knees before Adrian caught him, the king's strong arms the only thing preventing him from falling completely. The assembly had erupted into chaos, accusations and theories flying as various factions tried to understand what they had just witnessed. But through the noise, Chiron had heard one voice rising above the others, a woman whose tone carried both authority and barely concealed fury. "The Omega bloodline lives. The Sealmaker's descendants still walk among us, and this changes everything." He had looked up through blurred vision to see a tall figure standing at the edge of the gathered representatives, a woman whose presence radiated the same kind of power he felt in Adrian, but colored differently, shaped by purposes he instinctively knew were hostile. She had been looking directly at him, and the expression on her scarred face had been complex. Recognition, calculation, and underneath it all a hunger that made his blood run cold. Her name, he would learn later, was Lysandra, and she commanded a warband large enough to be called an army, loyal to her personally rather than to any territorial authority or clan structure. And she had been waiting for news of the Alpha King's return, with plans already in motion to ensure it resulted in outcomes favorable to her vision of how the world should be ordered. She believed that the only path to lasting peace was the complete elimination of the Alpha bloodline and the systematic suppression of any Omega power strong enough to challenge the new order she was building. And she had spent decades positioning herself and her followers to act decisively when the moment came. Chiron's manifestation of power had confirmed for her what her intelligence network had already suggested, that he was the key to both controlling and ultimately destroying Adrian, a tool to be acquired and used regardless of the cost. The assembly had been adjourned in disarray, representatives retreating to consult with their respective authorities while Chiron and Adrian were returned to their confinement. But the atmosphere had shifted, guards now watching them with fearful respect rather than casual contempt. And Kessa herself had come to speak with them, her manner suggesting genuine concern beneath her professional discipline. She had explained what her sources had revealed, that Lysandra was mobilizing forces, that the fragile consensus among the clans was fracturing under the pressure of competing interests, and that if they valued their lives, they needed to leave Elvaris as soon as possible, before the situation deteriorated into open conflict that neither of them would survive. Adrian had asked where they should go, and Kessa's answer had been delivered with the flat certainty of someone reporting facts rather than offering opinions. To the archives, to the historical records that might explain the connection between them, to the documents that could reveal why an Omega bloodline had sealed the last Alpha King, and what their descendants were supposed to do when he awakened. She had also warned them that Lysandra's people would be watching every route out of the city, that escape would require both luck and capability beyond what seemed reasonable given their current circumstances, but that she would do what she could to create an opening because, despite her professional obligations, she did not believe that executing Adrian served any purpose except to feed the ambitions of those who sought power through violence rather than through wisdom. That night, in the darkness of their confinement, Adrian had finally asked the question Chiron had been dreading. What had happened during the assembly? Where had that power come from? What was he that he could manifest abilities that should belong only to bloodlines dead for centuries? Chiron had no answers that satisfied either of them, could only repeat what little his mother had told him about his father being different, about carrying ancient blood, about gifts that frighten people. Adrian had listened in silence, and then spoken words that changed everything once again. I knew someone once, long ago, who had your eyes and your voice and the same stubborn determination that logic alone should govern the world, who stood beside me when my court demanded war and argued for patience and understanding that we might find another way, who sealed me away, because they believed it, the only path to prevent total annihilation of both our peoples, and who promised with their dying breath that we would meet again when the time was right and the world had learned from its mistakes. The words had hung between them like a bridge across an impossible gulf, and Chiron had felt tears he did not understand running down his face, grief for losses he had never experienced warring with recognition of truths that his conscious mind rejected even as something deeper inside him knew them to be absolutely real. Adrian had reached out and wiped those tears away with gentle hands that knew the gesture, had done it before in circumstances neither of them could quite remember. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of sorrow that had defined him since awakening. I do not know if you are truly them returned, or merely someone who bears their bloodline and power, but either way, I cannot lose you again. Not to Lysandra's ambition or to any force in this strange new world, and whatever bond exists between us, I will honor it as I honored them, even if it costs me everything I have left. They had escaped Elvarus 3 nights later, using a distraction Kessa's people had arranged, and following a route through the city's underground drainage system that brought them out in the marshlands south of the main settlement. Pursuit had followed within hours, Lysandra's forces apparently having anticipated their flight and positioned scouts along all the obvious escape routes, and for 5 desperate days, they had run through wilderness that Chiron barely understood, and that Adrian navigated through instincts honed in an age when these lands had looked very different. The king's strength was returning more rapidly now, fueled by necessity and perhaps by the proximity to Chiron and whatever power the younger man carried. And sometimes when they fought off the scouts that caught up to them, Adrian moved with the terrible grace of a predator that had no equal, and Chiron saw in those moments what it meant to be Alpha King in an age when such titles had carried weight measured in blood and fire. The archives at Thornhaven were housed in a structure that predated the Schism by at least 2 centuries, a monastery that had survived the Great War through a combination of strategic isolation and the deliberate neutrality maintained by the scholarly order that inhabited it. Chiron had known of the place through his research, had corresponded briefly with one of the archivists years ago before his academic dismissal had made such professional contacts untenable, but he had never imagined he would approach it as a fugitive running for his life with the last Alpha King at his side and a warband of trained killers pursuing them through the wilderness. The monastery stood atop a rocky promontory overlooking the Grey River, accessible only by a narrow bridge that could be easily defended or destroyed, and as they approached in the dim light of early dawn, Chiron felt a desperate hope that the scholars within would honor their ancient tradition of providing sanctuary to those who sought knowledge in good faith. The bridge was guarded, not by soldiers but by members of the order itself, men and women of varying ages who wore the simple gray robes of their calling and carried staffs that served purposes both practical and symbolic. The eldest among them, a woman whose face bore the deep lines of someone well into their 8th decade, had stepped forward as Chiron and Adrian approached, her eyes sharp with intelligence that age had not demimed, and she had spoken with the careful precision of one choosing words with full awareness of their weight. She had recognized Adrian for what he was, not through any supernatural sense, but through scholarship that included detailed study of pre-schism iconography and the distinctive bearing that marked those who had been raised to rule. And she had addressed him by his proper title before Chiron could attempt any explanation, declaring that Thornhaven had waited 700 years to hear what the last Alpha King might say about the war that had destroyed an age. They had been granted entry, though not without conditions that the elder scholar had outlined with absolute clarity. Thornhaven answered to no temporal authority, recognized no clan allegiance, and would not surrender those who sought sanctuary within its walls. But neither would it become a fortress or a staging ground for conflict. Adren and Chiron could remain as long as they made no attempt to involve the monastery in whatever struggles pursued them, and they would have access to the archives under supervision, with the understanding that knowledge discovered within those walls could not be used to bring harm to the order or to those it protected. Adren had accepted these terms with a grace that suggested he understood and respected the careful balance the scholars maintained, and Chiron had felt something in him ease at the recognition that there were still places in this world that valued wisdom over power and truth over expedience. The archives themselves were vast beyond anything Chiron had imagined. Chambers carved deep into the bedrock beneath the monastery, shelves and cabinets holding documents that stretched back 1,000 years and more, texts in languages living and dead preserved with care that spoke of devotion spanning generations. The archivist assigned to assist them was a man perhaps 10 years Chiron's senior, named Elric, who possessed the peculiar combination of obsessive attention to detail and genuine enthusiasm for obscure historical questions that marked the best of his profession. He had listened to their carefully edited explanation of what they sought, had noted the way Chiron unconsciously deferred to Adren, and the way the king's eyes lingered on the younger man with a protectiveness that went beyond casual concern, and he had made no comment on these observations, simply nodding and leading them deeper into the archives toward sections that few scholars ever accessed. The first documents Elric had retrieved dealt with the final years of the Alpha-Omega monarchies, accounts written by survivors of the schism that painted a picture of a world tearing itself apart over questions of power and justice that had no easy answers. The Alpha bloodlines had ruled for millennia, their strength and longevity making them natural leaders, but over time, the concentration of power had bred arrogance and abuse, with lesser castes treated as resources to be exploited rather than people to be served. The Omega bloodlines, fewer in number but possessing abilities that complemented and sometimes countered Alpha dominance, had traditionally served as advisors and mediators. But as grievances accumulated and inequities became impossible to ignore, Omegas had found themselves forced to choose between their traditional role of maintaining stability and their moral obligation to demand reform. The war, when it came, had been catastrophic beyond measure. Alphas who refused to yield privilege had called upon ancient pacts and supernatural forces that should have remained sealed, while Omegas, desperate to break the cycle of oppression, had reached for powers that came at terrible cost. Entire regions had been rendered uninhabitable. Bloodlines had been exterminated to the last child, and the very fabric of reality had been damaged in ways that still manifested in the dead zones that dotted the landscape 7 centuries later. Adren had read these accounts with a face that might have been carved from stone, showing no emotion even when descriptions of battles mentioned his name or detailed decisions he had made. But Chiron could feel the anguish radiating from the king in waves that made his own chest tight with sympathetic pain. It had been in the personal journals of an Omega scholar named Theron that they had found the first direct reference to the sealing ritual, a passage written in the careful script of someone documenting events for posterity, even as they participated in acts that would define an age. Theron had been part of the council that decided Adren must be removed from the conflict, had helped craft the ritual that would suspend him outside time until the world had evolved beyond the hatreds that made peace impossible, and the journal entries detailed not only the magical theory behind the working, but the emotional cost of betraying a king that many of them had loved. The most devastating passage had been the last one, written apparently in haste shortly before Theron's death in a skirmish that would occur 3 days after the sealing was completed, and Chiron's voice had broken as he read it aloud to Adren in the quiet of the archive chamber. The passage spoke of promises made in the deepest night, of an Alpha King who had set aside his crown to hold an Omega advisor, who wept for a world that seemed determined to destroy itself, of plans made for a future they both knew they would not see together, of a binding created not by ritual but by choice, 2 souls recognizing in each other something that transcended caste and politics, and all the divisions that drove others to violence. Theron had written that they believed in reincarnation, believed that souls returned in new forms until they learned what they needed to learn, and they had promised Adrian that if such things were true, they would find him again when the seal broke, would know him regardless of how time had changed them both, would stand beside him in building the better world they had failed to create in their own lifetimes. The journal had included a sketch, rendered with surprising skill, showing two figures seated together in what appeared to be a private garden, and though the artistic style was archaic and the details somewhat stylized, Chiron could not deny the resemblance between the Omega in that image and his own reflection, the same angular features and serious expression, the same slight build that had always made him feel inadequate compared to larger and more physical men. Adrian had taken the journal from him with shaking hands, had traced the lines of that sketch with fingers that seemed to be remembering the act of drawing it, and when he finally spoke, his voice had been raw with emotions too complex to name. He had known Theron would die, he said, had argued against the plan to seal him away precisely because it would leave his Omega without protection in a war that showed no mercy to those who advocated for peace. But Theron had insisted that his survival was more important than theirs, that someone needed to be preserved who remembered what they were fighting for, rather than merely what they were fighting against. Elric had watched this exchange with the careful neutrality of a scholar observing phenomena beyond his direct understanding, but he had also been kind enough to leave them alone in the archive chamber for several hours, giving them privacy to process discoveries that clearly touched on matters far more personal than historical research typically involved. Chiron had used that time to read more of Theron's journal, and with each page he felt a growing certainty that the memories bleeding through from his visions were not imagination or wishful thinking, but genuine recollection of a life he had lived in another form, another age. He remembered conversations Theron had recorded, could finish sentences before reading them, knew the private jokes and references that appeared in the margins because they had been his jokes, his references, his hand that had written them 700 years before he was born into this current life. The weight of that knowledge was crushing. It meant that his entire existence had been shaped by forces set in motion centuries ago, that the dreams that had driven him to pursue forbidden research had been echoes of Theron's purpose calling across the gulf of death and rebirth, that even his mother's journal and pendant had likely been inheritances passed down through a bloodline specifically tasked with finding and freeing Adrian when conditions were right. It meant he was not truly Chiron, or rather that Chiron was merely the most recent name attached to a soul that had worn many faces and lived many lives, and the person he thought he was had never been more than a temporary construct, destined to dissolve once Theron's memories fully integrated with his current consciousness. Adrian had found him curled in a corner of the archive chamber, shaking with terror at the prospect of losing himself to a past life that seemed more real with every passing moment. And the king had gathered him close with a tenderness that contradicted his severe appearance, speaking in the ancient tongue with words that carried both authority and desperate pleading. He had sworn that Chiron would not be lost, that whatever memories returned would add to rather than replace the person he had become, that Theron had been reborn rather than merely sleeping, and that the soul they had both loved remained present in this new form, regardless of how much or how little of past lives could be recalled. The words had helped, though they could not entirely banish the fear, and Chiron had clung to Adrian with a need that embarrassed him, but that he could not suppress, seeking reassurance in the physical reality of the one person who seemed to understand what he was experiencing. They had spent 5 days in the archives, and during that time the pursuit that had driven them from Elvaris had caught up, though not in the direct assault Chiron had feared. Lysandra's forces had established a presence in the villages surrounding Thornhaven, not attempting to breach the monastery's sanctuary, but making it clear that the moment Chiron and Adrian emerged, they would be captured or killed depending on which served Lysandra's purposes better. Messengers had arrived daily, some bearing threats and some bearing offers of negotiation, all of them ultimately demanding the same thing, that Adrian submit to judgment by the assembled clans, and that Chiron be turned over to Lysandra's custody, for purposes she insisted were purely protective, but that everyone understood meant imprisonment at best and execution at worst. The elder scholar who governed Thornhaven had met with these messengers personally, hearing their demands with patient courtesy, before reminding them that the monastery's sanctuary had stood inviolate for 800 years and would continue to stand regardless of whatever temporal powers thought to challenge it. When one of Lysandra's captains had made the mistake of threatening to cut off supplies to the monastery until its inhabitants saw reason, the elder had simply smiled and noted that Thornhaven had survived sieges before and maintained stores sufficient for years of isolation, and that if Lysandra wished to waste her forces waiting for starvation that would not come, she was welcome to demonstrate such poor strategic thinking. The captain had left in visible anger, but no actual assault had followed, suggesting that even Lysandra understood there were limits to what actions the other clans would tolerate. Within the archives, Chiron and Adrian had continued their research, and with Elric's assistance they had uncovered documents that explained the mechanics of the bond they felt between them. The sealing ritual had required an anchor, a living connection to ensure that Adrian could eventually be retrieved rather than lost forever in temporal suspension, and Theron had volunteered to serve that function, binding their life force to his in ways that would persist across death and rebirth. Every descendant of Theron's bloodline carried a fragment of that binding, dormant and undetectable, until brought into proximity with Adrian, at which point it would activate and create the compulsion to free him that had driven Chiron's entire life. The bond was not merely magical but fundamental, written into the deepest levels of their beings, and it explained why they could sense each other's emotional states, why distance caused physical pain, why Chiron had manifested Omega power during the assembly when Adrian was threatened. The documents also warned of dangers inherent in such bindings. The longer they remained in close proximity, the more their individual identities would blur, memories and personality traits bleeding across the connection, until distinguishing where one ended and the other began became impossible. Eventually, if the bond was allowed to develop without intervention, they would effectively become a single consciousness inhabiting two bodies, losing the independence that made them individuals. The original ritual had included safeguards meant to prevent such merging, but those safeguards had been designed for the original participants and might not function properly with a reincarnated soul whose current form had no training in managing such connections. Elric had pointed out passages suggesting that the bond could be dissolved, severed cleanly in ways that would leave both parties intact and independent, though the process required considerable Omega power and precise knowledge of the ritual structure, neither of which they currently possessed. Alternatively, the bond could be maintained at a lower intensity, kept at levels that allowed connection without threatening individual identity, though achieving such balance required conscious effort and mutual agreement to enforce boundaries that instinct would constantly push them to violate. Adrian had read these passages multiple times, his expression growing darker with each review, before finally declaring that he would not accept dissolution of the bond, even if it meant eventual loss of self, because existence without Theron had been 7 centuries of emptiness, and he would rather merge completely than face that void again. Chiron had not known how to respond to such naked declaration, had felt simultaneously moved and terrified by the intensity of emotion Adrian showed so rarely, but with such devastating completeness. His own feelings were complicated, tangled between his current life's learned caution around attachment and Theron's memories of love so profound it had shaped decisions that affected millions. He did not want to lose himself, did not want to become merely an echo of someone who had died before he was born, but he also could not deny that when he looked at Adrian, he felt something that transcended any rational bond, a certainty of belonging that made the thought of separation physically painful. Their discussions of the bond and its implications had been interrupted on the 6th day by news that Lysandra herself had arrived, leading a force large enough to be visible from the monastery walls, and that she had requested formal audience with the elder scholar to present terms she claimed would resolve the situation peacefully. The elder had granted this audience, though she had made clear that Thornhaven's position was not subject to negotiation, and she had invited Chiron and Adrian to observe if they wished, noting that hearing Lysandra's arguments directly might provide useful intelligence regardless of whether they intended to accept her offers. The audience had been held in the monastery's great hall, a chamber whose ancient stones had witnessed countless debates and decisions over the centuries, and Lysandra had entered with an escort of 6 warriors who carried themselves with the precise discipline of elite fighters. She was tall for a woman, nearly matching Adrian's height, with a build that spoke of strength earned through constant training and scars that mapped a life spent in combat. Her face was handsome rather than beautiful, with strong features and eyes that assessed everything with calculating intelligence. And when she spoke, her voice carried natural authority that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed without question. Her terms had been presented with logic that Chiron had to admit was compelling if one accepted her fundamental premises. The old world had destroyed itself through conflicts between Alpha and Omega powers, she argued, and the new world had achieved stability precisely by suppressing those powers and preventing any individual or bloodline from accumulating the kind of influence that led to the tyrannies and wars that had defined the pre-schism age. Adrian's survival was an aberration, a remnant of a failed system, and his mere existence would inspire others to seek the return of the old hierarchies, destabilizing the carefully maintained balance that had taken centuries to establish. His death, if handled properly, could be made to serve as a symbol that the age of Alpha Kings was truly ended, and that the future belonged to those who embraced new structures rather than clinging to ancient privileges. As for Chiron, Lysandra had been almost gentle in her explanation of why he could not be permitted freedom. His Omega power was significant, possibly the strongest to manifest in generations, and if left uncontrolled, it could become a rallying point for those who believed the old castes should be restored to their former prominence. She did not wish to harm him, she insisted, merely to ensure he was kept safely contained where his abilities could not be exploited by factions less scrupulous than her own. She would provide comfortable imprisonment, education in controlling his power so it did not damage him through uncontrolled manifestation, even opportunities for limited research under supervision. But his liberty was a luxury the world could not afford given what he represented. Adrian had listened to this with visible restraint, his hands gripping the arms of his chair hard enough that Chiron could see white showing around his knuckles. And when he finally responded, his voice had been cold enough to frost the air between them. He had told Lysandra that her logic was the same logic that had justified every tyranny in history, the claim that individual freedom must be sacrificed to collective security, that those with power must be killed or imprisoned not for what they had done, but for what they might theoretically do, that the only path to peace was the elimination of anyone who might disturb it. He had lived through the war she claimed to wish to prevent, had seen firsthand what happened when fear and suspicion became the basis for policy, and he could tell her with absolute certainty that her proposed solution would create exactly the kind of oppression that would eventually spark the very conflict she claimed to wish to avoid. Lysandra had smiled at his response, an expression without warmth or humor, and noted that his reaction proved her point. He still thought like an Alpha King, still assumed his judgment should override the consensus of those who had built the current world, still believed his personal convictions justified defying the legitimate concerns of millions who had no wish to return to an age of supernatural tyrants. She had then turned to Chiron and asked him directly whether he truly wished to tie his fate to a man who would lead him into conflict and suffering for the sake of principles that belonged to a dead age, or whether he might prefer to accept protection that would allow him to live a safe if circumscribed life, free from the burdens of Adrian's doomed crusade. Chiron had felt all eyes in the hall upon him, had known that his answer in this moment would shape everything that followed, and he had drawn on something that he thought might be Theron's courage as much as his own as he met Lysandra's gaze and spoke words that came from both past and present. He had told her that safety purchased through submission to tyranny was not safety, but merely slower death, that a life lived in chains was not truly life, regardless of how comfortable those chains might be, and that he would rather face whatever consequences came from standing with Adrian than accept the false peace of imprisonment dressed in pretty words. He had seen approval flash in Adrian's eyes and anger tighten Lysandra's expression, and he had known that whatever slim chance of peaceful resolution might have existed had just evaporated beneath the weight of his declaration. Lysandra had risen from her seat and declared that she had made good faith effort to resolve this situation through reason, and that if they chose to reject her generous terms, they would have to accept responsibility for the consequences. Thornhaven's sanctuary would be respected, she said, but the moment they left its protection, they would be hunted with every resource at her disposal, and she would not stop until either they surrendered or their bodies proved that even Alpha Kings could die. She had then swept from the hall with her escort following, leaving behind a silence heavy with the knowledge that open conflict was now inevitable. The elder scholar had remained seated throughout this exchange, and after Lysandra's departure, she had turned to Adren and Karen with an expression that managed to combine exasperation with a certain grim respect. She had told them that they were fools for refusing terms that might have preserved their lives, but that she understood the kind of pride and principle that made compromise impossible for those who had already sacrificed too much. Thornhaven would continue to offer them sanctuary as long as they wished to remain, but she would also be honest that sanctuary was not solution, merely delay, and eventually they would have to leave and face what waited beyond the monastery's walls. That night, unable to sleep despite exhaustion that went beyond merely physical, Chiron had found his way to the monastery's library, a smaller collection of texts focused on philosophy and spiritual matters, rather than the historical documents that filled the archives. He had been seeking distraction, something to occupy his mind so he would not spend the hours until dawn cycling through fears and regrets, and instead he had found Elric, who apparently also struggled with sleep and who had been sitting at one of the reading tables with a volume of ancient poetry open before him. They had talked, cautiously at first and then with growing ease, about subjects that had nothing to do with Alpha Kings or Omega powers, or the conflicts that had defined both their lives. Elric had shared his own story, how he had come to Thornhaven fleeing a family that wanted him to take over their mercantile business, and how he had found in scholarship a purpose that satisfied him in ways that profit never could. Chiron had spoken of his mother, of the dreams that had driven him to pursue knowledge the world insisted did not exist, of the loneliness that came from always being the person who saw patterns no one else recognized and asked questions no one else thought to ask. At some point, the conversation had turned to the nature of identity, whether people were defined by the memories they carried or by the choices they made in present time, whether the soul persisted across lifetimes or whether each birth was truly a new beginning, regardless of what echoes might remain from past existences. Elric had admitted he did not know the answers to such questions, that scholars had debated them for millennia without reaching consensus. But he had offered his personal belief that what mattered was not where we came from, but what we chose to do with whatever time we were given. If Karen carried memories from Theron's life, those memories were part of who he was now, but did not erase the 28 years he had lived before they surfaced. And if he chose to honor Theron's commitments, that was valid, but equally valid would be choosing his own path even if it diverged from what his past self might have wanted. The words had been surprisingly comforting, a reminder that he still possessed agency even if his choices were constrained by circumstances largely beyond his control. And when Karen had finally returned to the rooms he shared with Adren, he had felt fractionally more at peace with the impossible situation they faced. He had found the king standing at the window, looking out at the darkness beyond the monastery walls where Lysandra's forces were camped, and without speaking, Chiron had moved to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, offering and receiving comfort in the simple fact of presence. Adren had spoken quietly, his voice carrying across the darkness between them, asking if Chiron regretted his answer to Lysandra, if he wished he had accepted the offer of protected imprisonment rather than tying his fate to a king whose prospects were bleak at best. Chiron had considered the question seriously before responding that regret was complicated, that part of him would always wish for a quiet life dedicated to research with no one trying to kill him, but that another part recognized he had never truly been meant for such a life, and that standing with Adren felt more right than any decision he had made in years of trying to fit himself into a world that had no place for what he was. The king had turned to look at him then, golden eyes reflecting lamplight in ways that made them seem to glow, and he had reached out to cup Chiron's face with a gentleness that contradicted the strength in those hands, studying him as if trying to memorize every detail. He had spoken in the ancient tongue, words that Chiron understood through Theron's memories, even though his current life had never formally studied the language beyond basic reading comprehension, saying that he had loved Theron with an intensity that had frightened them both, that he had spent 700 years in darkness sustained only by the promise they had made, that he saw Theron in Chiron's expressions and mannerisms, but also saw someone new, someone shaped by different experiences, and carrying their own validity, and that he was trying to learn how to love both the memory and the reality without conflating them in ways that would be unfair to either. Chiron had not known what to say to such declaration, had felt emotions rising in his throat that threatened to choke him if given voice, and instead of speaking, he had simply leaned forward until his forehead rested against Adrian's, accepting the contact and the vulnerability it represented, acknowledging feelings he was not yet ready to name but could no longer deny. They had stood that way for a long time, breathing together in the quiet of the room, and when they finally separated, it was with the unspoken understanding that something had shifted between them, some barrier eroded by honesty and need. The next 3 days had passed in strange calm, a pause in the urgency that had driven them since the vault opened, and they had used the time to prepare for whatever came next. Elric had continued helping them research, focusing now on practical matters, maps of the region showing possible routes to other repositories of knowledge, contacts within various scholarly communities who might offer aid or at least neutral space, techniques for managing the bond between them so it did not overwhelm their individual identities during times of stress. The monastery's healers had examined them both, declaring Adrian remarkably healthy given his ordeal, but noting signs of strain that suggested his body was still adapting to being active after centuries of suspension, and diagnosing Chiron with malnutrition and exhaustion severe enough that it was affecting his ability to control his emerging powers. The elder scholar had provided them with supplies for travel, including clothing more suited to their needs than what they had been wearing, and she had also given them something far more valuable: letters of introduction to other scholarly communities throughout the region, sealed with Thornhaven's mark and carrying the monastery's authority, asking that the bearers be given access to archives and offered basic hospitality in the name of knowledge and learning. She had been clear that such letters would not protect them from Lysandra's forces, but they might open doors that would otherwise remain closed, and in a world where they had few allies, every potential source of support mattered. On the 10th day of their stay, scouts brought word that Lysandra's forces were pulling back, withdrawing from the immediate vicinity of the monastery to positions farther south, and speculation ran rampant about what this might mean. Some believed it was a strategic retreat, that Lysandra had decided direct confrontation with Thornhaven's neutrality was too costly and was repositioning to intercept them on the roads leading away from the monastery. Others thought it might indicate internal problems within her warband, dissent among her followers about the wisdom of pursuing Adrian with such single-minded determination. The elder scholar had counseled caution, noting that Lysandra had not achieved her position through stupidity, and that any apparent weakness was likely calculated to produce some advantage not yet visible. Whatever the truth, the withdrawal created an opportunity, and after consultation with the elder scholar and with Elric, Karen and Adrian had decided to leave Thornhaven before the situation changed again. Their destination was the city of Ashenmoor, 3 weeks' travel to the northwest, where another repository of ancient texts was maintained by a different scholarly order that allegedly included documents specifically focused on Omega abilities and their management. If they could reach Ashenmoor, they might find answers that would help Karen control his power, might discover safeguards for the bond that would preserve their individuality, might even uncover information about Lysandra and her true objectives that would help them counter her pursuit more effectively. They had departed before dawn, leaving through a lesser-known path that descended the northern face of the promontory and joined the main road several miles from where Lysandra's scouts would expect them to emerge. The elder scholar had personally seen them off, offering final advice that amounted to trust their instincts, stay alive, and remember that knowledge was worthless if you died before you could apply it. Elric had embraced them both, extracting promises that they would send word when they reached Ashenmoor so he would know they had survived. And Chiron had felt unexpected emotion at leaving behind one of the few people in his life who had treated him with genuine kindness absent any ulterior motive. The first week of travel had been relatively peaceful, their route taking them through sparsely populated territories where Lysandra's influence was weak and where the few people they encountered showed no interest in the affairs of travelers who paid for what they needed and caused no trouble. They had fallen into patterns of cooperation born from necessity, Adren using his greater physical strength and combat training to handle tasks that required such capabilities, while Chiron managed the practical details of navigation and negotiation with village merchants. They talked as they walked, long conversations that ranged across subjects both profound and mundane, and slowly Chiron began to understand the man Adren had been before the war and the sealing, the king who had genuinely cared for his people and who had tried to find paths between tradition and reform that would satisfy the legitimate needs of all castes. The visions came less frequently now, or perhaps Chiron was simply learning to integrate them more smoothly with his current awareness. But when they did surface, they brought details that filled gaps in the historical record. Memories of specific councils where decisions had been made, of private conversations between Adren and Theron, where they had argued about strategy and philosophy, of moments of tenderness stolen between the demands of leadership and the pressures of war. Each vision left him more certain of the connection between his current self and his past life, but also more determined to be Chiron who remembered Theron rather than simply Theron reborn as Chiron, a subtle distinction that mattered enormously in terms of how he understood his own identity and agency. It had been on the 8th day that they encountered the first sign that Lysandra's withdrawal had been strategic rather than genuine retreat. They had stopped in a village called Ravenholm to purchase supplies, and the merchant they dealt with had been nervous in ways that went beyond normal caution around strangers, his eyes constantly flicking to the road as if expecting someone. Chiron had pressed gently for information, using techniques of casual conversation he had learned during years of research in archives where scholars jealously guarded their knowledge, and eventually the merchant had admitted that riders had come through the day before, asking questions about travelers matching their description, and paying generously for information about routes and destinations. They had left Ravenholm immediately, abandoning part of the supplies they had purchased in favor of speed, and that night they had camped far from the road in a dense copse of trees that offered concealment if not true protection. Adren had taken first watch, and Chiron had tried to sleep despite the anxiety that made rest difficult. But sometime after midnight, he had been pulled from fitful dreams by the king's hand over his mouth, and a whispered command to be absolutely silent. Through the darkness, he had seen shapes moving between the trees, at least a dozen figures spreading out in patterns that suggested professional search tactics, and he had known with sick certainty that Lysandra's hunters had found them despite their precautions. The fight that followed had been brutal and terrifying, Adren moving with lethal efficiency to cut down attackers before they could coordinate effectively, while Chiron had tried to stay out of the way and not become a liability that would divide the king's attention. But there had been too many, and eventually one of them had gotten past Adren's guard and slammed into Chiron with force that drove the air from his lungs and left him gasping on the ground while hands gripped his arms and a blade pressed cold against his throat. The attacker had shouted for Adren to surrender or watch his Omega die. And in that moment, something inside Chiron had broken free, power surging through him with intensity that made his earlier manifestation during the assembly seem trivial by comparison. Golden light had exploded from his body, throwing his attacker backward with force that left the man unconscious or dead against a tree trunk, and that same light had lashed out at every hostile presence within range, not killing but stunning, leaving Lysandra's hunters collapsed and groaning, while Chiron stood at the center of a circle of devastation with power still crackling across his skin in patterns that matched the markings on Adren's body. The king had stared at him with an expression that mixed awe and concern, and when he spoke, his voice had carried warning. That much power uncontrolled would burn Chiron out from within, that he needed to pull it back before it consumed him, that Omega abilities were not infinite, and using them beyond his capacity would destroy him as surely as any blade. Chiron had tried to follow the instruction, but found he did not know how. the power responding to his terror and his desperate need to protect, rather than to conscious direction, and he had felt it beginning to spiral beyond his control, feeding on itself in ways that made his vision blur and his heartbeat stutter irregularly. Adren had crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, had pulled Chiron against his chest and wrapped arms around him that felt like anchors to reality, and had begun speaking in the ancient tongue, words that carried not magic, but command. King's voice that expected obedience from every level of being. The power had responded to that voice where it had ignored Chiron's panicked attempts at control, gradually receding back into whatever reservoir it normally inhabited, and Chiron had collapsed against Adren with relief so profound it left him shaking. They had not lingered, gathering what gear they could and fleeing deeper into the wilderness, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the site of the attack before exhaustion forced them to stop. When they finally made camp hours later, Chiron had been barely conscious, drained by the power expenditure in ways he had not anticipated, and Adren had held him through the remainder of the night, keeping watch over him with a vigilance that suggested the king expected further pursuit at any moment. The journey to Ashenmoor had taken another grueling week, every mile shadowed by the knowledge that Lysandra's forces were close behind, and when they finally reached the city's walls, both of them were exhausted beyond what simple rest could repair. The scholarly order that maintained the archives there had honored Thornhaven's letters of introduction, granting them access to the collections and a safe place to recover, though the scholars made clear their neutrality would not extend to active protection if Lysandra's forces breached the city. In those ancient texts, Chiron had found what they desperately needed: detailed instructions for managing Omega power without being consumed by it, techniques for maintaining the bond with Adren while preserving their individual identities, and most crucially, references to a prophecy that predated the schism by centuries. The prophecy spoke of a time when the last Alpha King would return, freed by an Omega of the Sealmaker's bloodline, and together they would either heal the wounds of the ancient war or reignite it in ways that would make the original conflict seem merciful by comparison. The choice, according to the prophecy, would not be theirs alone but would be shaped by the actions of those who feared or welcomed their return, by the decisions made in moments of crisis when principle and survival stood in opposition. Chiron had read these passages to Adren, and they had both understood that their mere existence had become a catalyst for forces larger than themselves, that people like Lysandra would act according to their beliefs regardless of what Chiron and Adren actually intended, and that the only path forward was to prove through action, rather than words, that the age of Alpha Kings returning did not mean the age of tyranny restored. It had been on their 12th day in Ashenmoor that Lysandra had made her final move, not attacking the archives directly, but instead seizing control of key points throughout the city, effectively trapping Chiron and Adren within a gradually tightening perimeter. She had sent a final message offering one last chance for surrender, Adren's willing execution in exchange for Chiron's safety and freedom to live under her protection. The king had refused without hesitation, and Chiron had been grateful for that refusal, even as he feared what it would cost them both. The scholars had evacuated the archives, unwilling to see their collections destroyed in the coming conflict, and they had offered Chiron and Adren a choice: flee through underground passages that would take them beyond the city, or make a stand and hope that Adren's power combined with Chiron's emerging abilities might be enough to counter Lysandra's superior numbers. They had chosen to stand, not from confidence in victory, but from understanding that running would only delay the inevitable, and that if they were to have any chance of building the future Theron and Adren had once envisioned, they needed to prove they could defend it. The battle had been everything Chiron had feared, and worse, Lysandra's warband storming the archive building with the precision of professional soldiers, while Adren fought with the terrible grace of an Alpha King defending what he valued most. Chiron had joined the fight, his Omega power responding more smoothly now that he understood how to channel it without being consumed, creating barriers of golden light that held back attackers and supporting Adren's physical strength with supernatural reinforcement that made the king faster and more resilient than even his natural abilities allowed. They had been losing despite their efforts. The sheer weight of numbers overwhelming skill and power. When something unexpected had occurred, other forces had entered the battle. Warriors bearing marks of various clans who had apparently decided that Lysandra's aggression had gone too far, that the destruction of ancient archives and the murder of those who sought sanctuary violated principles that even political pragmatism could not justify. The battle had turned into chaos as former allies found themselves on opposite sides, and in that chaos, Chiron had finally come face to face with Lysandra herself. She had been even more formidable up close, her presence radiating alpha power that rivaled Adrian's despite her being of a younger generation, and she had looked at Chiron with an expression that mixed respect with absolute determination. She had told him that she genuinely regretted what she had to do, that she believed he could have been an asset to the new world if circumstances had been different, but that his bond with Adrian made him too dangerous to leave free. Then she had attacked with speed that left no time for thought, only instinctive reaction. Chiron had met her assault with Omega power channeled through the bond, drawing on Adrian's strength as the king fought his own battles elsewhere in the building, and for a few desperate minutes they had been equally matched, her physical prowess against his supernatural abilities. But Lysandra had been fighting for decades while Chiron had barely begun to understand his power, and eventually she had gotten through his defenses, her blade opening a deep wound across his ribs that burned with pain beyond what mere steel should cause. He had collapsed, vision blurring, and through the haze he had felt Adrian's terror spike through the bond, had known the king was abandoning his own fight to reach him. Lysandra had stood over him with her blade raised for the killing strike, and in that moment, Chiron had understood with absolute clarity what Theron had felt 700 years ago when making the decision to seal Adrian away. Sometimes love meant accepting terrible costs to preserve what mattered most. He had reached for the bond, had opened himself completely to it in ways the archives had warned against, and had poured every bit of his power into Adrian across their connection, giving the king strength beyond what either of them alone could achieve. Lysandra's blade had descended, but before it could complete its arc, golden light had erupted from Chiron's body with such intensity that it had thrown her backward, and Adrian had arrived in time to catch Chiron as he fell, the king's face twisted with anguish that went beyond mere fear of loss. What happened next remained fragmented in Chiron's memory, consciousness fading in and out as Adrian had carried him from the battle, as the king's voice had commanded their unexpected allies to hold the line while he got his Omega to safety, as hands gentler than such strength should allow had pressed against his wound, trying to slow the bleeding that threatened to take everything they had fought to preserve. He remembered Adrian's tears falling on his face, remembered trying to speak words of comfort but finding his voice too weak to carry them, remembered thinking that if he died here at least it would be in the arms of someone who had loved him across the centuries and would remember him when this life ended. But he had not died. The scholars had returned with healers who possessed knowledge of treating supernatural injuries, and over days that Chiron barely remembered they had pulled him back from the edge of death. When he finally woke with full awareness, he had found Adrian sitting beside his bed, the king looking haggard and worn but alive, and the first words from Adrian's lips had been a promise. Never again would Chiron sacrifice himself for the king's sake, because Adrian could not survive losing him twice. And if that made him selfish, then he would embrace that selfishness without shame or apology. News had reached them as Chiron recovered. Lysandra had been captured by the clan forces who had intervened in the battle, and she now faced judgment from the very councils she had claimed to serve. Public opinion had turned against her aggressive tactics, especially once word spread that she had attacked a protected archive and endangered irreplaceable knowledge for the sake of her vendetta. The clans remained divided on what Adrian's return meant for the future, but most agreed that execution without trial was not the answer, and that if the Alpha King was willing to work within modern frameworks, rather than attempting to restore ancient hierarchies, perhaps accommodation was possible. Adrian and Chiron had stayed in Ashenmoor for 2 months while Chiron healed, and while they both learned to manage the bond at levels that allowed connection without threatening their individual identities. They had talked extensively about what future they wanted to build, about how to honor Theron's vision while acknowledging that Karen was not simply Theron reborn, about whether Adren could truly adapt to a world so different from the one he had known. Eventually, they had left Ashenmoor, not as fugitives, but as tentative participants in discussions about how supernatural abilities could be integrated into modern society without recreating the power imbalances that had led to the schism. It was slow, frustrating work that required patience neither of them naturally possessed, but it was also work that mattered, that might actually create the better world Theron and Adren had once envisioned, but failed to achieve. And through it all, they had each other, the Alpha King learning to live again in an age not his own, and the Omega Scholar who had freed him learning to be both Karen and the inheritor of Theron's legacy. The bond between them remained, managed but unbroken, a connection that transcended time and death and all the forces that had tried to keep them apart. It was not the ending either of them had expected, but it was an ending that allowed for new beginnings, and sometimes that was enough. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this tale of the Alpha King and his Omega, please subscribe to our channel for more immersive stories exploring supernatural romance, fated bonds, and epic adventures across time. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments what kind of stories you'd like to hear next. Your support helps us bring more content like this to life. Until next time, may your own journey be filled with connections that transcend the impossible. Subscribe now and join our community of story lovers.